Now, Helga, one of the points that you and your husband, Lyndon LaRouche, made repeatedly is that this whole strategic conflict is shaped by the demands of the City of London and Wall Street, the global financier interests who are insisting on continuing to be able to loot the world, but to do what? To prop up their bankrupt financial institutions. On the other side, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, excuse me, the moves toward Eurasian integration. Obviously, it would make sense to scrap this confrontation and look for cooperation. But you've recently raised the whole question of whether or not NATO should continue to exist. How would you look at this today?
Well, I mean, for Germany, for example, or most European countries, and even for the United States itself, to be in an alliance which, if it comes to war, would mean the extinction of all of its members, is not exactly a rational choice. Now, the United States may think that because they are a large island and that they are many miles away from Europe and what they consider the potential theater of war, there may be the illusion. But I think if it comes to war this time, it would be a global war, including the United States. For Europe, for Germany, it would mean within the first minutes of the conflict, Germany would cease to exist. So I think what we need is a very serious debate. Does it make sense to be in a military alliance, which, if it comes to military conflict, which is what a military alliance should protect against, you cease to exist? I think we should, reflect on that, because when the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 91, essentially NATO should have dissolved because it lost its raison d'etre. The enemy was no longer there. We proposed a peace order at the time in the form of the Eurasian Land Bridge. But, there was even a period where there was a long consideration to even include Russia into NATO, or to change the security alliance in such a way that it would accommodate the new situation. And I think we have now very seriously a situation where we have to replace NATO with a new security architecture which guarantees the survival and security interest of all. I mean, if you look in the history of such alliances or treaties, one can see very clearly only when the security interest of all was taken into account did it have a lasting impact on peace. When it was not the case, it led to war. The two most famous examples of this is obviously the Peace of Westphalia, where after about 150 years of religious war in Europe, and more particularly the 30 years of the 30 Years' War, it was clear that nobody would enjoy the victory if the war would continue, because there was, in parts, 1/3 of everything was destroyed. In other areas, half of everything was destroyed: houses, villages, people. So then, in the 4 years of the negotiation of the Peace of Westphalia, basically the previously warring parties agreed on principles which would guarantee a durable peace. And the Peace of Westphalia is still a very important precedent for what we should be doing today. The principles were that for the sake of peace, you have to forgive all what was done by the one side or the other. Then the second principle, for the sake of peace, you have to take into account the interest of the other. And that is a very, very important principle, because you cannot continuously have peace if you ignore blatantly the security interest of one or more of the relevant countries. Now, where it was not considered was famously the Versailles Treaty, where, contrary to the reality of what was leading to World War I, Germany was given the guilt, to be the only guilty party. They had to pay enormous war preparations, which the Reichsbank then solved with printing money. That led to the hyperinflation. That then you had the depression, and then out of all of this, you had the Second World War, which was sort of the next chapter, of the First World War. So the Versailles Treaty, is really what people should think about, because if you don't take into account the interest of, in that case, Germany, that led to the rise of the Nazis, that led to the right-left street fighting, the total collapse, and naturally the economic conditions. So what we need today, therefore, if we consider this, that we need a security architecture which does take into account the interest of everybody, and that it emphatically includes Russia. It emphatically includes China. And therefore, I think that given the fact, um, I believe since a very long time that you can, with this complex mess which we have as a strategic situation, that you cannot take a partial problem and think you can solve it, maybe for a short period of time, but that because we have a collapse of the neoliberal financial system, it's a question of time. We have a hyperinflationary blowout going on right now. You will see enormous disruptions because of the energy price, the food price. We have famines. We are threatened with the danger of social chaos. So we need a solution which really addresses all of these problems at the same time. And it just happens to be that was what was developed by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, for many years, is what is still the solution. So what we need is a reform, a reorganization of the bankrupt financial system. We have to get rid of this massive speculation, which is hot air in any case. And just because billionaires have become billionaires, that doesn't mean the real economy is not collapsing, and many people become poorer and poorer, and billions of people are starving. So we need to change that, have a global Glass-Steagall system, go back to Hamiltonian national banking, and then have a new credit system in the form of a new Bretton Woods. Now, that only can be agreed upon on the top level of maybe the G20. Maybe that's the gremium which should call on an emergency basis such a reorganization. Then we need, the economic cooperation among nations, which what is the obvious framework for, would be that Europe and the United States cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative in the development of Latin America, of those parts of Asia and Europe which are not yet developed, a reconstruction of the US economy, which is very urgent. The US is in a terrible state of collapse. The urgent development of Africa and Southwest Asia. So there's plenty for these countries to cooperate. And I think it was Chess Freeman who recently said, so what if the Chinese are building railroads? Let American trains use these railways. If the Chinese build a highway, let American cars drive over those highways. In other words, just because China has already engaged in the Belt and Road does not mean that other countries should not cooperate. I mean, just think about the enormous problems we have to solve. The development of Africa, the overcoming of the worst humanitarian crisis, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, many, many other countries. So what we should do is we should put the Belt and Road Initiative on the table in the form as we proposed it, namely the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, agree with long-term economic cooperation agreements to engage in these projects, which would transform the world, and make it a livable place for every country and every person on this planet. And then take that economic cooperation as the basis for a new security architecture, which would not just take care of NATO's interest, but which would include, security guarantees for Russia, China, and every other country. I mean, this is feasible. It's rational. It's, it would solve all problems at the same time. And, the question is, can mankind take a solution which is so obviously needed and, just requires a few people who have a vision, who have the courage to come forward in a moment like this. And I think, that is what we should mobilize the population for, because that is the clear alternative to the extinction of the civilization.